Most of the people who spoke Japanese to me would ignore any of my mistakes, but my friends who were English speakers would absolutely tear me to pieces and would laugh at the things that I would say. But they didn't hold back at all, they didn't pull their punches. So that was really useful. I was really surprised when I was told there was an international event there. I was thinking, well, surely it's going to be half Japanese and half non-Japanese, but it was actually like 90% non-Japanese and 10% Japanese. It was eye-opening. Any organisation, if they want to remain the same size, then they should operate like a small organisation. But if they aspire to be big, then they should put in place right now those measures that would be necessary to be a bigger organisation. And then you almost automatically, by nature, starts to give itself capacity to grow.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Tokushikai Inside Look podcast. Today we're speaking with Watson Sensei from the UK. Watson Sensei has achieved the rank of Iaido Renshi Nanadan and Jodo Renshi Nanadan from the All Japan Kendo Federation, and has been a major contributor to the British Kendo Association, formerly as Bucho and National Coach of both arts. Watson Sensei currently teaches Iaido and Jodo at Ryoshinkan Dojo in London and Surrey, and is also the author of the Shugyo Blog and Andy's Nihongo Corner, teaching Japanese language to Iaido and Jodo practitioners all over the world. In this first, and I hope many conversations, we learn about his initial discovery of the budo arts and living in Japan, and cover many other topics including the process of language learning, martial arts coaching, and organizational systems. So without further ado, here's Andy Watson Sensei.
Okay, so my name is Andy Watson. I was born in 1971. I come from the UK. I was born in a town called Ashford in Middlesex, which is just outside of London, underneath the Heathrow Airport flight path. So I've got pure kerosene flowing through my veins. I guess from when I was a child, I was always interested in the sort of magic of martial arts. I have to be really honest here. I think my first exposure to martial arts and getting me excited about it was a cartoon called Hong Kong Phooey, which older listeners might remember. But it was such a brilliant child's lead into martial arts and kung fu that I always wanted to do it when I was a child. And then when I was about 14 or 15, I started doing karate at the local karate dojo that my friend introduced me to. I stayed there for a couple of years, but as I started doing work, I lost the time to go. And then while I was working, I used to work for Heathrow Airport. One of my colleagues suggested that I make contact with his karate teacher, which was a few more miles away, a guy called Mick Haggerty, who taught Shotokai karate, which is an offshoot of Shotokan. So I made contact. Then I stayed with Mick Sensei for years, actually, and learned Shotokai. He was a really quite strict teacher, and of every 2-hour karate session, at least 1 hour was on extremely energetic drill training with weights, push-ups, sit-ups. So if anything, it got me really fit when I was young and sort of built up a certain degree of musculature, which stayed with me, especially my legs. The same guy who recommended me to Mick also recommended a TV program called Way of the Warrior. It was a BBC documentary series, and it was quite special for its time. It was a really good, serious, in-depth view on Asian martial arts. And there was one particular episode of it, which was about Tenshin Shoden Katori Shintoryu, which was explained as being one of the sort of unbroken samurai styles of Bujutsu. And that really got me interested in going to Japan and sort of learning something very classical. So by this time I was about 20-ish, and I said to my karate teacher, Mick, I said, I really want to go to Japan and learn budo, but not necessarily karate, but something a bit more classical. So he fully supported me, and he sort of encouraged me to learn Japanese. So I started learning from books and tapes and that kind of thing for a few years. And then when I was, actually this must have happened a bit earlier, about 19 years old, I was starting to go to Japanese adult education classes. And then my Japanese teacher suggested I go on a homestay program in Japan. This was organized by a company called Euro Center. So when I was 19, I found myself for the first time in Japan, traveling from Tokyo to Kanazawa, which is without a bullet train, actually. So that was quite a long slog. I barely spoke any real Japanese. I sort of learned greetings and things like this, but I couldn't really say very much. But I took this schlep over to Kanazawa on the slow train and stayed with a family for a month, and every day went to a Japanese language class with other foreigners staying in Japan, which was an absolute blast. 19 years old, didn't really have a house or any financial commitments, so all of the money I had was being spent on good Japanese food and beer and sake and beer and then more beer. And so the
Not
month
unlike right now.
exactly, yeah. Quite right, yeah. And made some really good friends in my class. It was only a small class, about 5 people. And so that really got me fired up and wanting to maybe come and live in Japan a bit more.
So there was never an inclination towards budo for this trip?
There was really. I mean, the raison d'etre of the trip was to improve my Japanese and also put out feelers to see whether or not I could make any contact with budo teachers. It turned out that in Kanazawa, if you look for the telephone directory or the yellow pages for them, that there wasn't really much in the way of budo classes that I could make out anyway. It turns out, I think actually there was an extremely big budo presence because Louis Vitalis, his teacher, he lives in Kanazawa, so there was at least some extremely good kendo. But I wanted to do something a bit more like kenjutsu or iaijutsu rather than modern day kendo. I went back to Kanazawa for another 2 weeks later on in the year and did a bit more Japanese language training. And then I came back, and then I was just desperate to try and find a job in Japan. And then my company, Heathrow Airport, or BAA as it was called at the time, or Heathrow Airport Limited as it became, started a personnel exchange program with Narita Airport Authority. And I was only a kind of on-the-tools engineer at the time. But I went for the job interview anyway, and one of the interviewers was the chief engineer of Heathrow Airport because I'd applied for it. And I was the only person that had been to Japan before who had showed an interest in the culture and the language. And I got chosen to go purely on that basis. It was originally a management position, but they chose me because they thought I could fit in well on what was going to be year 1 of this exchange program. So I was a prototype for that program. So when I was 24 years old, I was sent over originally for 9 months actually. It was originally a 9 month secondment to Narita, and they sent somebody over to Heathrow, a guy called Hiroshi Matsuzawa. And then after about 7 months, I asked for an extension, and Narita Airport also applied for an extension. It went to a year, and then it finally went to 2 years. So during that time, I spent the first 5 months, I think, in Tokyo, and the company sent me to a Japanese language school every morning for about 4 months, which was a huge boost. I mean, I got put into some departments where nobody spoke English sometimes, and it really showed the holes in my Japanese. You know, even though I'd done this homestay, it was still really difficult to get the brain tuned into understanding Japanese. It's a little bit easier if you're talking, of course, at that sort of level, because you can get by, you can express more or less what you want to say. But when people talk back to you in fairly casual Japanese, it's really, really hard. So I do sympathize with people when they say, it doesn't matter, Andy, how slowly you speak. When we speak to Japanese people, it just comes out as a kind of whole load of noise that we can't understand. I understand completely. And I think after about 6 months, I think my brain started to rewire itself slightly. And everybody was kind of helping me to speak Japanese, and I was socializing more with Japanese people. And gradually that switched where I could really comprehend what people were saying without having to expend lots of effort. I started to pick up keywords and started to get the gist of what people were saying. 6 months is quite a long time if you think about it, to be living in a country. But I guess that was roughly the sort of time when I started to feel that I could express nearly everything that I wanted to say by using alternative words if I needed to. And I could more or less understand what most people were saying to me, especially in casual conversation. It turned out that my Japanese language comprehension ended up being very finely tuned into understanding what engineering was in Japanese. So I can understand lots of things about airports and lots of things about engineering. But if I try and pick up a newspaper now, I still can't read almost anything that's written in the newspaper. So it's quite a niche. It was quite a niche kind of Japanese comprehension area. And then fairly early on, I think about 2 or 3 months into my stay there, I told my colleagues that I wanted to study classical budo or bujutsu. And they put me in contact with an Iaido teacher who worked for one of the subsidiary companies for Narita Airport, a teacher called Iaido Sensei. He was located over in Yokohama though, and I was living in Chiba, which is where Narita Airport is. So he suggested that I didn't train with him because it was too much of a slog to go from Chiba all the way through Tokyo to Yokohama. And he put me in contact with the local teacher in Chiba, who was Noguchi Hideo Sensei. Now, I think he's been to Canada or America once or twice before with Omi Sensei, I
The
think.
name sounds familiar. I don't think I've met him.
Okay, I remember seeing years ago, there's a photograph of him with a few other Japanese teachers in Canada. So I know he came over once or twice, so maybe a few people that you know will know of him. He was under the stewardship of Fujita Bunzo Sensei, who was a very well-connected Hachidan Hanshi. He learnt from Danzaki Sensei directly. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, Fujita Sensei. But he was a really nice guy. I actually phoned him first. And it's one of those rare occasions where a Japanese person speaks in such a way that you can understand almost everything that they say. And I think it requires a certain degree of consideration on the side of the speaker, that they realize that they're talking to a non-natural speaker and they speak slowly and clearly. And it was really nice. He made me really welcome to the dojo. But the actual dojo head itself was Noguchi Sensei. So Fujita Sensei was based in Tokyo. He looked after lots of the chi group. So I went along to my first Iaido class, all kitted up and ready. I had already been made to buy the Iaito and the hakama and the uwagi. So I turned up and started getting dressed. And Noguchi Sensei said, "Stop, there's something wrong." You put your hakama on first and you put your uwagi over the top and then you've tied your obi like you're doing karate. So he made me sort of strip off and start all over again, and he showed me how to put everything on properly. It was quite funny. And then during that first Iaido lesson, they then said, "Oh, we're going to do Jodo next." And I said, "Oh, I want to do Jodo as well. I really want to do Jodo." I picked up this interesting Jodo from reading a book called Moving Zen by, oh God, the guy's just recently passed away, but he was quite a pioneer of going to Japan and writing. Oh, C.W. Nichol. He was somebody who went over and studied, I think, Shotokan karate years and years ago. And then he trained with people like Don Draeger and some of the real halcyon age people of budo in Japan. And he learned Jodo as well, I think at Shimizu Sensei's dojo. So I sort of got this flavor for doing Jodo as well, just from reading this book. And it, by good luck, they did Jodo and Iaido in Noguchi Sensei's dojo. So I trained there for best part of the 2 years that I was there. I took part in the Chiba Prefectural Iaido Taikai and got silver, which was a massively wonderful experience and quite a surprise that I should do so well. It was funny, actually, in that Prefectural Taikai, I was Shodan. And even at Shodan, I think we did 2 or 3 Koryu and 2 Seitei, or the other way around. But we did, no, I think it was two Koryu and 3 Seitei, even at Shodan. So that was quite eye-opening, really. Wasn't expecting that, but it was really nice, and I met some really nice people.
Is that unique at the time?
I think a lot of places at prefectural level did Koryu at fairly low grade, actually. I didn't really have any other experience, to be honest, of other places. But yeah, I'm not really sure. But I think it's fairly common that they do Koryu at fairly low grades. At that Taikai and during other occasions, I also met Anthony Kundi, who I think still lives in Japan. He's now become quite an important link to the outside world for Suioryu. So he is one of Katsuse Sensei's main students. And he's a real stalwart in Budo in Japan for people who are coming into Japan. He's a great source of information. He's written lots of stuff. He helped organize, or maybe he almost single-handedly organized the recent Don Draeger meetings in Tokyo, which were really interesting to watch as well. He was, at the time, he was under Kadano Sensei, who was a Suioryu teacher living in Chiba. But me and him used to hang out quite a lot at the events in Chiba, which was really nice as well.
So how did 9 months secondment become 2 years?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the guy who came over to the UK, he was going to be here for 2 years. That was set up at the very early stage. But Heathrow Airport, I think, were a bit nervous about this, not having had done it before. So they said, well, maybe 9 months is enough. And then as we got towards the end of that 9 months, I didn't want to go home. And Narita Airport didn't want to let me go either. So they wrote to Heathrow and said, how about we extend it to the year? And Heathrow agreed. And we went to immigration and got an extension to the visa. And then as we got close to the end of 12 months, I then said, I still don't want to go home. And they got it extended another 6 months. So it went from 9 months to 1 year to 18 months. So went back to immigration again, got the visa extended. And then when it got up to 18 months, I said, do you know what, I really want to do 2 years. And everybody in Narita said, this is really difficult because this has been 3 extensions to the visa. 3 extensions to the visa. So this is unheard of to have it extended another time. Sorry, 1 extension to, no, sorry, it would be 3 extensions to the visa. They said 1 extension is quite normal, 2 is quite rare, 3 is unheard of. And everybody said, no, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. And I was really gutted because I had it in my heart that I wanted to stay for this full 2 years. And then I think somebody in Narita Airport went up to the Ministry of Transport, jumped across, came down to immigration and pulled some strings and got it done, which was pretty amazing, really. I don't think that's easily done. So it was definitely a case of knowing the right people, I think.
Was it some kind of goal or thing that you had wanted to achieve within that 2 years? Or was it just like, I'm not ready to leave?
I think it was that. I think it was, I'm not ready to go yet. And knowing that my counterpart was going to be there for 2 years made me think, I also want to do 2 years. I almost knew for sure that at the end of the 2 years, there's no way I could have got it extended any further because I would have had to return and then my successor would have had to come out. But I just thought, I just don't want to go home. I'm not ready to come home yet. I absolutely loved my 2 years there. It was the experience that really made me, I think. There's no other event in my life that had such a change on me.
Before we continue on, you mentioned a few different ways you have been learning Japanese. One, you had done it in the UK, then there was the homestay, and then when you finally moved there for work, there was this morning classes. Could you maybe talk about the differences between how you were learning Japanese in those different situations, and how have you applied that different ways to teaching Japanese?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It was very interesting. When I went to Kanazawa for the homestay program, I think the Japanese teachers who were in Eurocenter, the international school, were under instruction to not speak English during the lessons. They would teach Japanese in Japanese. And it made it obviously quite challenging sometimes. And in the class, we had to rely on each other to help each other. Some of us were a little bit more advanced than others. Some of us were more... I didn't speak any other second language at that time. I'd learned a bit of French at school. I was awful at French, and I was awful at German. But there were other people, like you might be aware that most Swiss people speak about 3 languages. There was a couple of Swiss people in our class, so they were picking up Japanese really, really quickly, which was really good because they could help the rest of us. So there was that. And yeah, that kind of immersing you in Japanese from the very beginning. There was no explaining the grammar in English in detail. It was very much throw yourself in it and just get your head to be immersed in Japanese. When I went to the Tokyo classes, I think the level of grammar that they were trying to teach was a little bit harder, a little bit higher. So they did teach some things in English. Normally talk about my personal life very openly, but I dated a couple of Japanese girls while I was there as well, and had one long-term relationship with a Japanese girl. And that obviously helped immensely because although she'd lived in England and she spoke some English, it just seemed natural to speak Japanese all the time. So almost all of my personal life, almost all of my budo life, almost all of my working life, I was only speaking Japanese. Almost all the people I met were Japanese. I had very few non-Japanese friends there. I did make friends with a few people from an English class in Narita. And I had some English friends in the company in Narita Airport who had been seconded overseas for a couple of years and who spoke really good English. And they became my best friends. And it was a relief for me to be able to speak English to them because sometimes you just need to talk without making an effort. Other things about the classes. Do you know that I would say that in the Andy's Japanese Corner thing that I'm doing at the moment, to be honest, the biggest influence on that, to the whole style of the class, I didn't learn in Japan at all. It's actually by a language specialist called Michelle Thomas, who has made lots of different CDs and cassettes about learning the language. And the key secret to his system is that you start off with the thing that you do know. So everybody knows some Japanese. They know Tokyo, they know sushi, most people know konnichiwa or arigato. They know how to say something. So you start off with that kernel and you add something and you practice everything you know, then you add another piece and you practice everything you know. And you just do this and you repeat and you repeat and you repeat. And you don't actually spend that much time doing grammar. You do spend most of the time just practicing the stuff that you know. So this is the way that I've tried to build these Japanese classes, is to start the classes with some revision, add a new piece of grammar, and then practice it, just put it into use. Not having so much listening, ability, not so much having so much listening practice. So I don't speak that much Japanese during the formal sessions we have during the week. But I've now started a Sunday session it's called a ghost session, where I only speak Japanese to the class and they've got to try and work out what I'm saying. And occasionally I'll teach a simple part of grammar, something that's quite easy to learn by doing it this way.
This program that he created, is it something that you had already known about, or when you thought you're going to start teaching, you're like, I'm just going to research how he does it?
So I'd already learned the introduction to French, and it was amazing. Within the first hour, I suppose, I'd learned enough French to be able to make a really long sentence, which was "pas très confortable pour moi comme ça," which is, it's not very comfortable for me like this. Now that sounds like it's a kind of sentence that you'd almost never say unless you were locked up in prison. But actually, there's about 4 or 5 points of grammar in that you can switch and change and use for other sentences. And then I did the full Italian course. I didn't actually reach the end of the Italian course, to be honest. I started to feel like this kind of system that he uses, I did have to start writing things down. So in his system, the courses are audible. There's no books at all. And it's him teaching 2 other students. One of the students isn't so good and one of the students is a little bit better. And the idea is that you pretend to be the 3rd member of the class. And providing you're somewhere between student A and student B in terms of your level, you've got nothing to worry about. So that's how his system works. He will teach a bit of grammar, he'll give you an example, and then he'll ask you questions. He'll say, please say this in Italian or French or Japanese. And that's sort of 60% of the Addy's Japanese corner.
Okay. So it's not like this is how you learn Japanese, so you think it'd be useful for others. You adapted his system into Japanese?
Yeah, he's got a Japanese version as well, but it's not taught by him. He's one of his students teaching it. And Harry started using it. And it was all right. It didn't feel to me as quite as effective as his European language courses, actually. It was very much, this is this, say this. Whereas in his European languages, because he is an expert in European languages, the ones he was talking about, he could talk about the etymology of words and the etymology of the English language as well, and say, we say this because of this. So it was much more interesting. You learn much more about your own grammar from his courses. So actually, there is the one unique thing about his courses, which I've tried to use in mine, is he doesn't teach vocabulary as a distinct part of lesson. So in my courses, I've never really taught greetings or introductions or anything like that. I expect people to be able to pick the vocabulary up as we learn the grammar. So we start off with this skeletal structure of learning the grammar, and you hang vocabulary off of it. So I can introduce bits of vocabulary as we go through. But the idea is we focus on the grammar, we build up our grammar, and we incidentally learn vocabulary as we learn the grammar.
So if you were learning through this system and you were only familiar, let's say, with engineering and airport terms, you just had to learn the grammar to be able to converse in other contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I learned almost all of my grammar from the classes I went to. As you probably know, Japanese grammar is pretty simple compared to European, Slavic or Germanic languages. It's much more limited in terms of content. So I could actually learn almost all of Japanese grammar within, how much time did I spend? I guess about the first year of doing any formal training of Japanese. And then all the rest of the vocabulary I learned from experience, from using it and talking to people, rather than sort of sitting in a class with a dictionary going through it. I've done quite a lot of study through apps, I'm trying to self-teach myself kanji. And there's an app called Kanji something, I don't remember, it's on my phone. But that also helps me to learn some vocabulary as well. But generally, I think you learn, the whole theory of Michel Thomas's, the way that children learn, isn't by sitting down with books and reading books and doing it like this, but by life experience, by talking to people, and most importantly, by making mistakes and then being corrected. So this is a really important part of his system that I've tried to incorporate in mine, is by all means make mistakes. By all means make mistakes. And don't feel bad if I correct you, because you remember things by being corrected. That experience of somebody saying, no, you don't say that, you say this. You should remember that. That's more important than the actual data itself.
So did you find when you're living in Japan, because there's a tendency, Japanese are very polite, so they would probably not correct you on purpose. So were you learning through the classes more, or did you just have to over time you realized that you were saying certain things wrong?
That's a really funny question. You're right in that most of the people who spoke Japanese to me, who didn't speak English, would ignore any of my mistakes and try to work out what I was saying. But my friends who were English speakers, who were Japanese people but spoke English, would absolutely tear me to pieces and would laugh at the things that I would say, and then say, "No, you don't say that, you idiot. You say this." So they didn't hold back at all. They didn't pull their punches. So that was really useful. The experiences I remember the most, actually, about learning Japanese were the stupid things that I said, the real funny things. So whenever I'm sitting at a dinner party and somebody says, "Tell me something interesting about Japan," I'll normally repeat one of these times that I've made myself look really, really stupid, where I've said the wrong thing. Like, I'll give you an example. The best one I think of is I was receiving this engineering briefing from the head of mechanical engineering at Narita, and he had all his support engineers there as well in this meeting room. And one of the female assistants came in with teas and coffees, and I knew her. I'd met her before, and I said, "Oh, hi." And she said, "Oh, hi, Andy." And the director of mechanical engineering said, "Oh, have you met her before?" And I meant to say, "Yes, we have met before." But instead I said something which almost sounds the same in Japanese. I said, "Yes, I love you." And everybody in the room just creased up at this moment. No, that's not the right thing to say, is it? This was when I was in Narita. It was in, I guess, the first few months, because you start to be careful about not making those mistakes again after you've done about 30 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you went back to the UK after this, and then...
Let me explain the sort of end of my period in Japan. As I got towards so I went out in July, I think, and I was due to come back for the full 2 years. I was due to come back, I think, in July again, 2 years later. When I got to about May, Noguchi Sensei, my teacher, said, "Okay, you're going back to Europe, so we probably need to think about how you're going to train in the UK. The best person to speak to is the guy that I know goes over to Europe a lot, which is Ishido Sensei." So I was in Noguchi Sensei's office in Tokyo one weekend, and we talked about this. And so he got Ishido Sensei on the phone, and he handed the phone to me. And I took it back quite nervously, because even after 2 years, trying to understand what somebody's saying in Japanese on the phone is really hard, because you don't have any body language, or, you can't always hear exactly what they're saying. So I nervously picked up the phone and said, "Moshi moshi, Andy des." And again, this was one of those times when you know that you've met somebody who really understands communication well, because I understood every single thing that he said on that telephone conversation. Usually I would run into problems and get maybe down to about 60%. Occasionally, even with my own teacher, I would go down to like 20% comprehension. But with this telephone call to Ishido Sensei, he spoke slowly and clearly, and I understood 100% of everything that he said. So he said, "It's okay. There's a few people in the UK that you can link up with. We'll talk about it later." And then so then shortly after that, there was a 6th and 7th Dan Iaido grading in Edogawa Sports Center in Tokyo. And Noguchi Sensei said, "Let's go. We can go and meet Ishido Sensei." So we drove to Edogawa Sports Center, and then I was wandering around outside with my teacher, and he said, "Oh, there he is. There's Ishido Sensei." So we wandered over to this guy who was wearing this loud, I think, sort of sea blue jacket, or it might have been magenta, purple or something. Looking very different to everybody else around him, who was all wearing black suits and ties and things. But I remember seeing him and thinking, wow, he looks really kind of outgoing. And he was wearing this really loud jacket, and his hair is naturally curly. But you probably know that Yakuza intentionally perm their hair. I might be wrong, but I seem to remember him wearing rings as well, which is quite rare for Japanese. I thought he had quite a few gold rings on. So I went up and introduced myself and shook his hand, and I just thought to myself, Jesus, this guy's Yakuza. Which turned out to be completely wrong, of course. But he was my idea of what a Yakuza looked like. But, he was really, really nice and friendly. And then at the same event, my teacher also introduced me to Oshida Sensei as well, who was also at the grading. He was just there sort of looking around. And I was also introduced to Jean-Pierre Rake, who unfortunately passed away, I think, 2 years ago. He was one of the first people to get 7th Dan Iaido in Europe. Really nice guy. He was there trying for his 7th Dan. I didn't speak much French. He didn't speak much English, but went up and said, "Hi, my name's Andy. Are you taking your 7th Dan today?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Oh, good luck," in French. And then that was about the limit of my conversation. But so I met 3 really nice people on the same day. And then that same year, in June, was the 1997 International Iaido Taikai. So it was the first time there's ever been organised a world Taikai. It wasn't actually a competition, it was like the Kyoto Taikai, so it was an Embu Taikai. And it started off with, God, I don't know how many people were there. I've got a photograph of everybody who was there in Kyoto at Heian Shrine? Yeah. So we did this big Embu in front of the shrine out on the gravel. There was, I think, about 20 or 30 people there from the UK. I guess there was about 200 people there in total. So I went along the first day, did the Embu, got the little sake plate. And then there was a seminar for 2 or 3 days, I think. It was really cold, actually, even in June. And then I met lots of people from the BKA who were in my class. I think I was still Shodan at the time. And I think really by fortune, good fortune, the teacher of our first Dan group was Yoshido Sensei. So he saw me and said, Andy, how are you doing? Could you translate for me to this class? Which was the first time I've been asked to translate. So I sort of nervously said, yeah, okay, I'll give it a try. And again, because he speaks such easy to understand Japanese in such simple, easy to understand terms, I believe I was able to translate pretty successfully, pretty easily for a few days. At this event, I met Al Colborne, who was in my group, Gavin Murray-Thrippland, Jock Hobson, Loy Lee. There's quite a few other people there. I didn't really get a chance to speak to many of them. Chris Buxton I met for the first time. And then, so during that time, Yoshido Sensei said to me, where do you live in the UK? I said, oh, near Heathrow. He said, I think your closest person is Loy Lee, so go and introduce yourself. So I walked up to Loy Lee Sensei and said, oh, are you Loy Lee? And she looked up and said, yes, what do you want? I said, oh, hello. My name's Andy. I'm coming back to the UK soon. Can I come and join your dojo? Yes, call me when you get back. which is typical Loy, really. She's a really nice person, but she doesn't put on any airs and graces. And then I was repatriated, so I came back to the UK. Had a few months of settling down, getting back to work. I didn't do much budo training except by myself for the first few months. And then I sort of put out feelers, and I looked at the BK website and actually found there was a much closer to the dojo to my work, which was Chris Mansfield's dojo, Seishinkan, in Ealing. At the time, Chris Mansfield was also living in Japan. He'd gone out to Japan the same time as I had, but he was due to stay there for years and years. So I went along and met Alan Nash and Tony Brocklebank, who were the dojo leaders, and Hilary Hadley, and they looked after me. And so from that time to about 2013 or 14, I think, I was there and trained with some really nice people.
I should add that at the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014, that Harry and I formally left Seishinkan. We reached a mutual agreement with Chris Mansfield to leave Seishinkan, and we went off and set up our own dojo and formally broke ties with Chris for reasons that I won't go into on this podcast.
Can I talk for a second about the difference in training, actually?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. After about 5 years of being there, it really occurred to me that the focus on training was really different to mine in Japan. So for the 2 years in Japan I was there, I was really intent on trying to learn as much choreo as I could, because I didn't really know for the first couple of years, for the first 18 months, say, if there was any Iaido back in the UK. This was before the internet was really going. So the only way that you could ever know that there was any was to look in yellow pages and, look in martial arts magazines and that sort of thing. I had no idea if there was any sort of great amount of Iaido going on in the UK. So I just focused on learning as much Koryu Iaido and as much Koryu Jodo as I could. My teacher gave me copies of Shimizu Sensei's Jodo manual, so I was trying to learn as much Koryu Jodo by myself when I did self-training at the company gym. So the entire focus was on content, it was on, volume of stuff. So every time I went training, I spent about 10 hours a weekend, 5 hours on Saturday and 5 hours on Sunday at the dojos, and was really helped along by some really nice people. I want to put a shout out to Kawase Sensei, who was my Iaido senpai, but we were compatriots in Jodo. He was a rare person. He was the same height as me. So he was about 185 centimeters tall. And we did our Jodo exams together, which was amazing, because if you can imagine I'm 6'2", trying to find somebody to do Jodo with. Height is really important. It can be very hard to do Jodo if your partner is much shorter or much taller than you. But Kawase Sensei was about the same height. So we went through our first 2 grades together, which was really nice. And for the first few months, every class, I would turn up early to the dojo and try and revise what I'd done the previous week. And he would come along early and give me a preview of the next kata. So he didn't overstep the mark and try and teach me, but he would show me the next kata and say, it looks like this, Andy. And then Noguchi Sensei would turn up and actually teach me the next kata. But I was really hungry for knowledge, so I would ask, and my teachers would keep feeding me information. But I couldn't say that in the first 2 years, because I was so intent on volume, that quality was really good. In fact, I've got a video of me doing Embu that a colleague took of me towards the end of my 2 years there when I was just coming up for Nidan. And if I look at it now, it looks absolutely dreadful, as you'd expect, of course. But then when I came back to the UK, people like Alan Nash and Steve Boys, so Steve Boys was my compatriot and Alan Nash was my senior. They really worked on technique, technical correctness and quality and all these other stuff that I hadn't really been exposed to that much while I was in Japan. Not for any shortcoming of my teachers, but my Japanese wasn't really good enough and the classes were fairly big, and Noguchi Sensei would try and teach things that were basically above my head. So he would teach things for the rest of the class that was filled up with 7th dans and 6th dans and 5th dans. So they can understand the subtleties of what he was teaching, but I couldn't really get it. Just my Iaido wasn't good enough, my Japanese wasn't good enough. So for the first 5 years of being in the UK, all of the focus was on quite a lot on Seitei Iai and Seitei Jodo and getting things to be correct. And that, I think, was a huge, going down a completely different channel, really, of Iaido, but really pushed me forwards because I was really enthusiastic and really driven, but I didn't really have the feedback and focus on technique that I needed.
When you're saying the difference in the class, it was not just what you were learning, but also the format. Like you're saying in Japan, Noguchi Sensei was more of a group. Let's learn all this stuff together. And when you came back, it was you got the individual attention.
Yeah, that was a large part of it. I was often giving a teacher to me during the training sessions because they were, I think about the Iaido class was about 3 hours long. So there's plenty of time to focus on lots of stuff, to do group training and then individual training. I would often be assigned a teacher to look after me, but I guess they didn't always know what to do with me, really. They weren't entirely sure that I understood sometimes, and often I didn't understand, or they didn't really know, this guy seems to be enthusiastic about learning lots of koryu. Should we spend much time on detail, or should we let him just hoover up all of this information? Certainly I wanted to hoover up rather than focus on detail. So maybe there was something there that just didn't really focus me on the fine points. Whereas having somebody explain things to me in English and give me, obviously the classes in the UK were much smaller. I guess that was a different perspective on it, really.
Okay. One thing I wanted to touch on was, because you started your practice in Japan, you wouldn't have as much exposure of that budo community in Europe before. And then you attend this international event and suddenly you see all these different countries. What was that like the first time you looked around and you're like, whoa, there's a lot of different people doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised. When I was told there was an international event there, I was thinking, well, surely it's going to be half Japanese and half non-Japanese, but it was actually like 90% non-Japanese and 10% Japanese. It was eye-opening, really. I didn't know that there was this. I didn't really understand, to be honest, the structure of the International Kendo Federation or the European Kendo Federation, and that there was all this organizational infrastructure outside of Japan. I never joined Iaido and Jodo with an intention to be part of a massive organization. I joined because I wanted to do budo. But it made me feel a lot better that I could go back to the UK and link up with people. And it was nice because during the seminar, which is when I met most of the Europeans, everybody there was a nice person. I remember most of the people that were there from the UK and a few of the people from Europe. And I'm friends with all of them, really. Sadly, a couple of them have passed away. But, these are all people who were as precious about their budo as I was, because they'd taken the effort to leave Europe, fly to Japan, and put themselves in the care of people who they didn't really know who some of these people were. They didn't know what they were getting themselves into. So that was, these were my brothers in arms, really. Yeah, that's the best way I can explain it, really.
And then there's these structural administrative organizations, and then there's the dojo lineage that has its own structure too. when you went back to UK, how did it fit into that structure? Was there a discussion around it, or was it just, whoever's convenient, I can go to their dojo and now I'm under that line?
Yeah, it was fairly informal, really. So Noguchi Sensei put me into Ishido Sensei's care when I finished in Japan. I hadn't broken all links with Noguchi Sensei, so for the first few years of going back to Japan on holiday and linking up with my girlfriend again, I went back to the dojos in Chiba and trained with Noguchi Sensei as well. So I sort of kept up links for the first few years. It wasn't like a really formal transfer. It was, well, I'm going back to Europe, so Ishido Sensei will look after you. But, don't lose touch. Call me, write to me now and again, what my teacher said. And then joining a dojo in the UK when Chris Mansfield wasn't there, it was informal. I just spoke to the sort of dojo head, which was Tony Brocklebank at the time. And he said, yeah, come along, Andy. And then I joined up. And then I met Chris when he came back for a winter holiday for the first time, actually. He came back for a couple of weeks for his twice a year returns to the UK. And it was done like this, really. So I didn't really know that I didn't meet Chris while I was in Japan at all. I'd been to Ishido Sensei's dojo a couple of times in holidays when I was over there, but it just happened he wasn't in a dojo at the time.
Okay. So now you're back training in this dojo, and you had looked at the BKA and they had this larger organization. When did you get involved more in organizational stuff?
So Alan Nash, who was my sensei come senpai for a lot of the time in Seishinkan, he involved himself in the BKA. He was the Jodo Bucho for, I think, nearly all the time that I knew him. And I wasn't really that involved that much in the first sort of from 2000 to 2005. I went to a few taikai, I went to the summer seminars, and I just got involved more and more with the events because Alan and the rest of the dojo were really keen to take part in BK events and European events. So I was pretty quickly sort of took part in the seminars and the European Championships. I think I did my first BKA taikai in 1999 and got my ass kicked in the first fight straight away, knocked out. But that made me angry, but it also made me driven and enthusiastic and determined to not lose again. So although I'm not a particularly sporty person or competitive person, that really made me competitive not in that way that I'm sure you understand that difference between sporty competitiveness and budo competitiveness. The idea is to improve yourself and fight against yourself, but standing on the shoulders of your rivals, basically. Rivals, not enemies. These people are there, they're targets for you to try and beat, to pull yourself up. And then you're grateful to them for being there, because without that, you wouldn't be driven and you wouldn't be determined. Sorry, I'm going off course quite quickly, as I often do. So, but at the time in the BK, there were lots of political things which were annoying that were happening. I won't go into too much details. It's not fair to only give one side of the story. But Alan was coming back to the dojo after having committee meetings and telling us what was going on. And, our dojo would sit there in the pub going, want to change it. And then around 2006, 2007, the Iaido Bucho, who was Vic Cook, came to me and said, I want to completely redo our entire coaching system. You seem to be somebody who writes a lot and can use a computer. Would you work with Chris Buxton to give our coaching system an overhaul? So for that, I think from 2006 to 2008, I took over the entire coaching system and with Chris redesigned it and rebuilt it. And that got me hungry a little bit to do more. And at that time, I noticed that people like Chris Buxton, who was the squad manager at the time, he involved himself in everything. He was a complete workhorse. He didn't really have that much of a formal position, but he would do a lot of the administration, a lot of the organisation. He was tireless. If you saw him at seminars, he would be the one who was doing all the registration for people, walking around with bits of paper and checking things and speaking to the Japanese teachers through JOC. And that really inspired me to sort of get involved, really, amongst other things. I've been translating at seminars, and I think at nearly every European Championships since 2001, I guess, or 2000. So I think the first one I went to was actually in the UK. And it was still being very much run by Ishido Sensei, because he was the one who got the European Iaido Championships and European Jodo Championships running in Europe. Despite what anybody says, it was him that got it going. Without him, we wouldn't have that European Championships, or it would be very different to the way it looks now. There's obviously lots of other people have contributed, but it was him that got it going. It was him that created the formal European Championships. So when I went along to the first one that I remember going to, he grabbed me and said, right, translate. So I was translating for all of the European Championships and all the BKA summer seminars. So I was kind of involved with supporting the organisation. And then from about 2007 or 2008, I asked Alan if I could take over as Jodo Bucho, and then was the Jodo Bucho and did lots of. I wanted to bring a management consultant kind of role to the Bucho role and go from writing things on scraps of paper and having things by word of mouth and starting to use the internet, start to use computers and start to use systems a bit more. So I tried to do a lot of that.
So North America, we don't have a coaching system and we don't have boos. Maybe you could describe what those are and what's involved with that.
Sure. Right. Where to begin? So let me just talk about very briefly the structure of the BKA, which is quite similar to the structure of the ZNKR. Underneath the association, there are 3 autonomous boos, one for Kendo, one for Iaido, one for Jodo. Each boo has got a Bucho, a director, a technical director at the top, and they will then have a number of officers that they work with. In the BKA, the 3 main officers of the boo are formally elected, and they co-opt other officers like a cashier, which is like a mini treasurer, squad manager, and a squad trainer. Coaching courses are insurers, probably. I'm not sure if they really care, but we have a duty of care, of course, to our members. And so we should have a formal coaching system to cover all the statutory requirements of being a coach in the UK under UK law. So in our coaching system we've got a level 1 coach, which is really about statutory compliance. So it covers health and safety, child protection. It now should be covering things like equal opportunities and, preventing prejudice or making it available to everybody. Yeah, it doesn't really talk that much about coaching, really. Mostly people will learn how to teach and how to coach from their own teachers and from experience. And then we've got a level 2 coaching system, which is about making you a better teacher. So the strapline is coaching athletes. And the idea is it doesn't matter whether or not you are Daley Thompson or if you're a bit unfit, not very strong. You don't have to be a hotshot, but you can, if you're smart, you can get the best out of people, which is what our level 2 coaching system's about. You can look at somebody and say, this person needs to do this. If I might give an example, there's my whole concept of the level 2 coach was there's a scene out of Chariots of Fire where Ben Cross is approached by the character played by Ian Holm. Ian Holm? The guy who plays Frodo in Lord of the Rings.
Bilbo?
Sorry?
He played Bilbo, the old one?
Sorry, he played Bilbo, big pardon, he played Bilbo, yeah. So he's like this little old character with a hat and moustache and a coat. And he walks up to Ben Cross, who's this 190 centimetre tall athlete, says, I can knock 1 second off of your 100-metre sprint. And he just does it by video, not by videos, of course, by watching films of athletes and watching himself, and by talking about things that you can do to change the way that you run. And I thought, that's it. Because we've got teachers in the UK who are 60, 70 years old, and they're teaching people who are 16 or 17 years old. So, you can't be just relying on your own physique to teach people. You've got to be able to use your head, and you've got to be able to communicate. So that was the whole kernel for the level 2 for our coaching course.
And just the motivation for developing this was more of a legal requirement, or were there teachers looking to say, hey, let's try to standardize this, I need some help, or blah, blah?
I think that the reason for rehashing the whole thing was that there was some breaking up in the BKA. There was a lot of friction between certain individuals. The guy who was running the coaching courses was a really good, intelligent coach who understood coaching theory and teaching theory and sports coaching, a guy called Ian Parker Dodd. And he brought to the coaching courses these kind of things about coaching theory. But there were problems going on in the BKA, and we wanted to create our own coaching system, which wasn't based on Kendo. So me and Chris looked at the entirety of the materials that was there already and said, okay, we really need an easy course for people to start coaching, to open dojos, and we need another course to make them better. So level 1 is all about the legalities, to get people to start opening dojos, which is what we really needed, was new dojos to increase our catchment of people. And then level 2 was about picking them up and saying, okay, you can be better at this. You can make champions.
So, of course, something that you create a while ago, and then as you get more experience in your own training, you always look back at these things and like, oh, I can tweak this, I can improve this, blah, blah, blah. How do you decide when it's good enough and when you should make some changes?
In terms of the coaching course, do you mean, or generally?
Yeah, because you're basically, that influences teachers. And as you get more experience, you become a better teacher too. So you're looking at this material and like, I can tweak it.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Initially, time is the restrictor. We didn't want our coaching system to make out that it was going to turn you from somebody that could do nothing into somebody that was going to be like this Ian Holm type. So our coaching courses are only 1 day long. We had to be quite conservative about what we were going to include. And it's difficult for me to answer that question, Patrick, because it was a long time ago, but mostly it was because I would go around to Chris Buxton's house and we would spend like a whole day arguing with each other in the nicest possible way. But no, me and Chris were really good friends, but we would argue, and we would start off with me saying we should do this, and this, and Chris would say, well, we should do it like this. This is enough, and I'd say, no, we're not covering enough, and he would say, well, we're not covering the important stuff, and we would argue, and we would verbally beat each other up about it, and eventually, after a few days of doing this, we would get to something which seemed like it could be delivered in a day. Now, to answer the question if it was enough, I don't know, I guess you just start off with a broad list of objectives, which would be quite short, say we want to cover this, and this, and then try and fill up the time. I'm not formally educated in sports science, or I did a little bit of management training when I was at BAA about sort of coaching behaviours and leadership behaviours, and I tried to put as much of that into it as I could. But it was generally sort of hardened and tempered by me and Chris just spending literally days arguing with each other before we got to something that felt about right and that could fit into 1 day of training. Does that answer the question or not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. I get the sense that you built this as a foundational piece to allow people to understand that there's certain objectives in the coaching. And then if the people wanted to, they can pursue it a little more on their own or find resources to adapt to their own philosophy of training and teaching.
Yeah, that's a much more pithy way of saying it than I said it. That's it exactly, really. What we didn't want to do with the coaching courses is spend a whole day of people sitting at a desk while somebody at the front waffles on and everybody falls asleep. So we tried to make the lessons as practical as possible. So we would try and get people to do certain coaching challenges during the day and not tell them they're doing it badly, and not necessarily the leader of those courses telling people your coaching is not very good, you should do more of this. But people would bounce off each other. So they'd give the candidates to the courses would give feedback to each other. So we never pretended, especially Chris and I, we never pretended that we were model coaches or we could really get people to be teachers. We just thought, well, it's experience and having feedback and self-development that makes you a good teacher. Very few people start off as born teachers. You learn it as you go along. So we were just trying to give people a bit of confidence and give them that opportunity to feedback with each other so that they would leave the course and think, I can do it. Because generally the delegates to the courses were, 95% of people are, perhaps 99% of people are good. Very few really evil, horrible people in the world. They normally get shoved out the corners of society. So everybody would give supportive feedback to each other and would, always pack a hard bit of feedback into a soft, fluffy coating so that people weren't hurt by it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're approaching time. Do you have 5 more minutes just for one last question on this subject? And then hopefully we can do another session where we can dig into other stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There's an official coaching certification program in Canada. I know in martial arts, I think judo and karate might be the only ones that have a program there. But there are certain benefits, I guess, being recognized by national sport organization. But we've never gone around to doing something like that. When would you say you should get into building a program like this? And if not, do you think that, it's just something that's useful but not mandatory?
Yeah, my instinct would be that as soon as you get to the size of organization where there are people in the organization that person A doesn't know person B, where there isn't clear and regular communication with everybody, is the time that you had to put formal systems in place. If it was a dojo by itself, everybody knows each other, communication is from person to person with no go-between, then there's no need to have any formality. The person who's in charge sees everything, everything's visible. And the person at the bottom of the dojo also sees everything. And with an organization, that can go on for a certain period of time if all of the dojos in that group are communicating and meeting regularly. But there must be that, as you said, there's that tipping point where person A, Fred Smith over here doesn't know Judy Jones over here. And that then means that you're not having clear and unobstructed communication. So person B might be doing something wrong, and somebody who should know about it in the organization doesn't. And then person B does something wrong, there's some legal or litigious event takes place, and then the organization is at fault. And they say, we didn't even know that we had to do that. And that's when lawsuits start to fly and insurance policies fall over. So I think if you think that that's where your organization is now, then it's now. And to be honest, we wouldn't, not that I'm trying to flog our stuff, but we wouldn't have problems in sharing our coaching content. The entire asset of our coaching course is just basically a set of PDFs that you give to somebody and say, if you're the course leader, there's the script, there's all the content, go and do it. It's not about knowing lots of stuff, it's about bringing people together, working through exercises, explaining some information, and off they go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be the opinion I would have. No matter how much resources you have out there, unless people are coming together and saying, okay, let's use this as a group, it doesn't matter. So
yeah, for sure.
I think, and that makes a lot of sense. Like right now, we're still relatively small. So while the discussion has to be around the right thing, like we're not just getting it for the sake of being more professional-like, there should be some benefit to it or reason.
Yeah. If I can just talk for a minute on this, I've got, well, it's not my theory, but I've read a theory and I believe it, is that all the time, any organization, if they want to remain the same size, then they should operate like a small organization. But if they aspire to be bigger, then they should put in place right now those measures that would be necessary to be a bigger organization. And then you almost automatically, by nature, by osmosis, by all these other things, these behavioral changes, the organization grows. It starts to give itself capacity to grow. People become interested in expanding the organization. I don't mean, you don't need your own IT system, of course, but all the time you're thinking like I don't mean you personally, all the time one thinks as a small group, then one has difficulty in expanding to a bigger group. And most groups want to expand. So I think it's always a good idea to think about what's the next biggest thing that we can do. Not the biggest thing, but what's the next big thing that we should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, these systems or programs or guides have always been something I've been interested in following. And I found your guide to hosting a Iaido, I think it also was Jodo? Taikai.
The floor manager's guide.
Yeah, the floor manager's guide. Yeah.
Yeah.
So since then, every single Taikai in Canada from 2008 to 2018 has been based on that guide.
Oh, great.
Including,
it's been useful.
Yeah, the Pan American tournament.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. I'm glad that it's been useful. Thanks for telling me.
It is extra effort people think that, oh yeah, there's no use for it. There is.
Yeah, I think I'm like you. I'm slightly nerdy about documentation and rules and procedures. And then some people aren't, and they say, well, why do we need it? We're not that big. And then you think to yourself, well, how big do you have to be? And if we don't need it, then we won't use it. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have it.
Cool. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Yeah,
and I'll see you tomorrow morning in Japanese class.
Great. Look forward to it.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patrick. Take care.
Have a good day.
You too. Cheers. Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode because we have a lot more exciting conversations to share as we explore the world of the traditional Japanese martial arts. The Inside Look podcast is available on most common podcasting platforms and on YouTube. Remember to subscribe to not miss out on new interviews as they are posted. We're always looking for feedback to improve, so please write us a review or drop us a line at podcast@tokushikai.ca or on Facebook and Instagram at tokushikai.canada. Until next time, thanks for listening.